Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or whatever time it is from where you're joining in. Welcome to the Role of the Church in Environmental Justice, a workshop presented as part of the Ecumenical Advocacy Days. It's my pleasure to present this workshop alongside my partner, Andrew Okong. We will be sure to do introductions more thoroughly in just a moment. We'd also love to hear who's joining us today. So if you'd be willing, please introduce yourself in the chat, just your name, if you're part of a congregation or organization, and where you're tuning in from. A few housekeeping items before we move on. The first is, please keep yourself muted throughout most of the program. We will have a couple opportunities for discussion. And we'll invite you to unmute yourself and join in that discussion later on. But until then, we ask you to stay muted. The second thing is, like I said, we will have a discussion and some question and answer time at the end. So throughout the program, please input any questions you have using the chat function, and we'll do our best to address those at the end. The third thing is, I know that Andrew wants to make sure we get a screenshot, a group photo with this group. So before we move on, I'm going to stop my share and hand it over to Andrew to facilitate a group photo here.
Thanks, Avery. So if you don't mind, and this is completely optional, you can turn on your camera so we can get like a quick screenshot. Again, we will make sure to blur out names. It's just probably just a quick screenshot that we could share as part of our promotional stuff. So if you want, you can turn on your camera. If not, we can still take the screenshot. So great. And I see stuff are still happening in the chat. So those with their camera on, which is like Avery and myself. Hi, Keith. Oh, okay, the cameras are on now. That's great. So if you could give me a nice wave or smile, and I will grab this quickly. I always tell people we're good with Photoshop, so we can make people younger if they have. That's my running joke. So smile. Okay, let me see how this turned out. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, not great. We're gonna do that again. Apologies. This don't save. Okay. All right, now a wave or a smile again. Sorry for that. Okay, and then let's see how this turned out. It's always a hit or miss with this. Oh, perfect. Okay, it turned out great. Thank you. We can go back to screen sharing mode, Avery.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Andrew. Okay. So I'm going to lay out the path for us today, just to share a little about where we're headed. So we'll start with some introductions about Creation Justice Ministries and the Climate Witness Project. Then we'll hear from Andrew on the connection between environmental justice and people of faith. He'll also be sharing about the need for environmental justice advocacy. And then for the latter half, I will be sharing about the connection between environmental justice and climate resilience, and what prayer can look like in an age of climate change. And then we'll end our hour together with some time for question and answer, but also discussion. And we want to make sure you have an opportunity to engage in some discussion with us and with each other. So to start out with an introduction, my name is Avery Davis Lamb. I'm the Climate Resilience Program Coordinator for Creation Justice Ministries. This is our mission. I'll spare you reading it. I'll let you take a look at it. But we work on a number of different issues related to the environment with 38 different member communions, Christian member communions. We are domestically focused, but most of our member communions have a global footprint. And so both because of that and because of the global nature of climate change, our work spans both domestic and around the world. And to give you a sense of our membership, these are the 38 member communions broken up into 5 denominational families, or 5 I guess, tradition families. You can tag yourself here, find if there's somewhere you fit in. We're not completely representative of the entire span of Christian expression, of course, but we are the most diverse Christian creation care network. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew to introduce himself.
Thanks, Avery. So my name is Andrew Opal, and I co-lead our Climate Witness Project. And as you see in this video momentarily, the Climate Witness Project is a campaign of the Christian Reformed Church Office of Social Justice and World Renew. And we've been working with congregations, individuals, churches, organizations as they really learn about the realities of climate change. I will say less on that, and we'll take a look at this quick video that really gives an overview of the CWP and ways that you can get connected as an individual or as a church. So yeah, we can play the video now.
Climate Witness Project. The Climate Witness Project, or CWP as we call it, is a campaign of the Christian Reformed Church's Office of Social Justice and World Renew, designed to walk with congregations as they learn about the realities of climate change, as they seek to be better stewards of the resources they have been given, and as they find their voice to speak to their public officials about common sense climate policy that will benefit the earth, people around the world who are poor and vulnerable, and future generations. We've had hundreds of individuals from more than 290 congregations and campus groups, representing over 20 denominations, including the Christian Reformed Church. And they've all come together to answer the call to love our neighbors and be stewards of creation. The Climate Witness Project works in 4 areas, which encompass a comprehensive approach to creation care. Those 4 areas are education, worship, energy stewardship, and advocacy. And here's a bit more about what this work looks like. Education. When we speak to churches or small groups, present at a conference, or have a table at an event, we're working to educate not only about the causes and impact of climate change, but also about the work of the Climate Witness Project. We have a great deal of resources, with everything from providing and recommending book studies and films to hosting speaking events, panel discussions, and workshops. Worship. Caring for creation is about action, certainly. And it's also about who we are, who God is, and how we relate both to God and creation. The Climate Witness Project offers many worship resources, including liturgies, prayers, sermons, songs, scripture references, and guidance as your community brings God's love of creation into your place of worship. Energy stewardship. Though it's not the easiest topic to tackle or project to get started, churches and individuals working diligently to reduce their energy consumption truly are doing the Lord's work. These projects look like conducting an energy audit, installing energy efficient appliances, adopting LED light bulbs, transitioning to an electric vehicle, growing your own food, collecting rainwater, or installing solar panels. There are so many possibilities. Advocacy. The CRC has always affirmed that the gospel must be proclaimed in both word and deed, and that a fundamental part of both proclaiming and living out the good news in this world is to raise your voice to our public officials. Public policy has tremendous power to promote justice, flourishing, and the common good, or to entrench systems of oppression and exploitation. When it comes to climate change, just policy is critical in order to move both the United States and Canada forward towards meeting the challenges ahead of us. Climate witness congregations have already been advocating with lawmakers and building long-term relationships with their legislators' offices. Building these relationships and making key decision makers aware of our concern is a key piece of the Climate Witness Project. And CWP staff are committed to walking alongside you and your congregation as you do this work. We can help set up meetings, offer coaching on how to conduct a legislative visit, provide talking points, and more. We want to help you raise your voice on behalf of God's creation and alongside our neighbors around the world who are poor and vulnerable. Lastly, if you want to stay up to date with important advocacy opportunities, the latest creation care resources, and news from other congregations walking the road of creation and climate justice, we provide regular action alerts to contact your elected officials via a phone call or email. Joining the Climate Witness Project is as simple as making a commitment to respond to climate change. This movement is a broad tent, and yet we're not broad in order to inflate numbers, but to invite more and more people into a new way of living. Together, each of us, by using our dollars, our work, and our vote, can create a sustainable future. Catherine Hayhoe, an evangelical Christian and climate scientist, says, "The number one objection I hear, both in the US and in many other countries, is we could do everything we can, but if no one else does anything, then it won't make a difference." Friends, climate action is not a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of the hill waiting to be rolled up to the top. It's already at the top and rolling slowly downhill. It just needs more hands on that boulder to make it go faster.
So yeah, that's just a quick 30,000 feet of what the CWP does. And as Avery mentioned, later at the end, we'll have more opportunities to talk about how to get connected and plugged in. So just jumping right into our topic of discussion today, which is the role of the church in environmental justice. We want to play this really short video, but it really situates our discussion well in talking about what environmental justice is and why we need to be talking about this and why we need to be finding solutions to the problem. So yeah, we can play the video.
Environmental justice really reflects the fundamental reality that vulnerable communities are all too often subject to the disproportionate burden of pollution and contamination. At the end of the day, when we're talking about environmental impacts, at the heart of it are real people's lives. And if you think about one child who's in her home that maybe has lead paint on the walls, she's drinking water from the tap that might have lead contamination in it. She plays in a playground that has arsenic in the soil and is developing asthma because of the polluting facilities next door. She goes into her school that has mold inside. These are real things that happen on an everyday basis. Not everybody has the ability to simply uproot themselves from a community where they've lived for decades, where their families raise them, where they raise their children. People don't have the financial mobility necessarily to simply get up and go. How do we combat environmental injustice? There are things like litigation. That means continue fighting in the courts, continue fighting to strengthen existing legislation, fighting to ensure that existing legislation is actually being enforced. Things like community organizing, public education, mobilizing the base, and elevating voices. There's also things like using media as an outlet to get your point across. In today's day and age, especially with this administration, I think there are an enormous amount of hurdles in how to address environmental injustices. But the reality is we have to keep fighting. Great gains do not occur overnight. They take sometimes decades. I truly believe that environmental justice is the modern day civil rights issue of our time.
Thanks, Avery. And so I think the main takeaway from that really short video snippet is that when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about the impact on real people, and this is not something that is abstract. But for our purposes, we just wanted to talk about the environmental justice movement and people of faith, and why people of faith need to be champions and walk alongside the movement. So there are a couple of points on the slide there, but what I want to really highlight is that beyond our compelling moral obligation as people of faith, beyond the critical voice we know that we have when it comes to lawmaking and policy, and beyond the tangible expression of our faith and love for neighbor is that people of faith have been there at the very inception of the environmental justice movement. Obviously, during the civil rights movement, there have always been calls for environmental justice, but most people look at what happened in North Carolina in 1982 as sort of the crystallizing moment of the environmental justice movement. And this is when toxic waste was being planned to be put in a facility in an African-American community. And just the rise of people of faith, particularly we have Reverend Joseph Lowry, among other prominent faith leaders, really rising to protest that and to show that that was not something that was morally acceptable. And so people of faith, as we know, have really been speaking out on this, and this is a time for us to continue to do that. There's one particular quote that I love from Austin Channing Brown. I know if any of you are familiar with her work, she talks about the fact that as often as the church has been the champion of the oppressed, the church has been the oppressor. And we always need to be careful to see where we sort of default to. And so in talking about environmental justice, we as people of faith really need to be keen and vigilant and see how we move forward with that. So yeah, we can move to the next slide, Avery. And so part of what we are trying to do and talk about is that there is a need for environmental justice advocacy. And as sort of for those who will be participating tomorrow in the sort of virtual Capitol meeting with legislative people on Capitol Hill virtually, there are a lot of things where we are trying to advocate for change. And this quote, and I will leave you to read that from Pope Francis, I think really sets the tone for what we are trying to do. So just giving people a couple of seconds to just look at that quote. And I think that really speaks to our moment right now and how people of faith can be leaders in this very movement. So next slide, please. So we want to continue to emphasize the idea that there's a need for environmental justice advocacy. And in doing that, there's a need for us as people of faith to really walk alongside, sometimes lead from the front, sometimes lead from behind, sometimes walk alongside impacted communities. Because like we say, people of faith have a critical voice in this conversation. There are people in our pews, in our congregations, in our churches who are deeply affected by environmental racism, environmental injustice. And so there's a need for us to keep advocating. And this is something that the CWP continues to do. And we walk alongside, like we said, a lot of congregations who really have made this a focus in their work. And so we just wanted to highlight these points as well, as you keep in mind why we need to talk about environmental justice advocacy. Next slide, please. So we wanted to just give a couple principles that we believe are very key in our advocacy work, especially when we're thinking about people of faith and how we advance this issue. There are certain key principles that we should keep in mind, again, as advocacy efforts are happening tomorrow for folks who would be participating in that. There are certain key principles that we always want to have in mind. Particularly, we want to keep in mind that new climate policies or solutions to the climate crisis always have in mind racial equity within vulnerable populations. We also want to keep in mind principles of just transition as we sort of wean ourselves from fossil fuel dependent economy that we find ourselves in. But one thing that I particularly want us to keep in mind that I want to stress is how we honor the voices and leadership of impacted communities in shaping their economic future. Most of the times when we come into the scene and try to really advocate with impacted communities, sometimes we fall into the default of not listening. And I think that's a posture that we need to really keep in mind. The fourth point, I think, is also very profound. We need to invest in resources to increase climate resiliency within vulnerable communities. And this is something that Avery will be touching on momentarily, but I think this is something that we need to keep emphasizing, that it's here, and we need to think about ways that we can be resilient, ways that we can adapt, and ways that we can mitigate the climate crisis. So that's a perfect segue into what Avery is going to walk us through on climate resiliency.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew. So we're going to spend a couple minutes here talking about environmental justice and climate resilience. And I just want to start with these two images of what's at stake for churches in the age of climate change and in regards to climate resilience. So we have two images here. On the left is West End Baptist Church from Lumberton, North Carolina. And this is what their property looked like in the wake of Hurricane Matthew. And on the right is Springs of Life Church in Casitas Springs, California. And this is one of the many California fires. I can't even tell you which one is in the background because of the severity of climate disasters that we've seen sweeping across not only the United States, but across the world in the last couple of years. And so what we're seeing is that climate change is directly impacting our churches. And in fact, in the same way that climate change impacts marginalized communities the hardest, it's impacting marginalized churches the hardest as well. And these environmental injustices require a response. The reality that we're facing in the year 2021 is that climate change is here and it's affecting our most marginalized communities. So what might it look like for our churches to take seriously the need for climate resilience? I want us to start out with a definition of climate resilience. We need to start with a definition because resilience is a really vague term, and the wrong kind of resilience can lead us down pathways to entrench the status quo rather than uprooting the status quo. So what does resilience mean, and how does it apply to climate change? This is a definition of resilience from a report called Pathways to Resilience from the Kresge Foundation. And they define resilience as climate change mitigation plus adaptation plus deep democracy. Resilience is these three things working in tandem. And what's important here is that resilience is not just a passive stance towards climate change. It's not simply bouncing back when disasters happen, but it's recognizing that a crisis can be an opportunity to bounce forward towards a more just and equitable society. That inherent in the need for climate resilience is to address the root causes of what caused the disaster, which means taking on climate change mitigation and means addressing the ways that our democracy has disenfranchised marginalized communities and continues to do so. So I want to make sure that we understand that resilience is entirely about bouncing forward and about creating a new society rather than just returning to the status quo. So who is directly impacted by resilience? Again, we'll return to a couple photos here. We know from the media that people who are affected by disasters are impacted by climate resilience. Climate disasters, as they're shown through hurricanes, we're only about a month away from the official launch of the hurricane season. And we're only a couple months away from the launch of the wildfire season. And what we know is that hurricane season is lengthening, and hurricane seasons or hurricane events are getting more intense because of warmer temperatures. And the same is true for wildfires. So what we're seeing is the unfolding of simultaneous climate disasters There were several moments this year where there were multiple fires burning in the West, multiple hurricanes forming in the Gulf and in the Atlantic, and flooding throughout the Midwest. So the reality is more and more people every year are being directly impacted by climate resilience. And it is environmental justice communities who are feeling those impacts first and most strongly. So we need to remember that if we don't feel like we've been impacted by climate change and climate disasters, it's probably because we have access to resources that allow us to be shielded from those impacts. Now, what I also want to invite us to consider is who is indirectly impacted by climate resilience. And we're going to take a look at this map real quick. So this map comes from a study, and I'll drop the link to the study in the chat. And what this study does is it models how people will move under 1.8 meters of sea level rise. And 1.8 meters of sea level rise is the reality of if we continue down our current path of climate pollution, the scientific prediction is that we will have 1.8 meters of sea level rise by the end of the century. So highlighted in blue here is every directly impacted county that will see those effects. And in red, we see a gradient here of how many people from those affected areas will move into those counties. So what you can see is dramatic migration from the coasts into the entirety of the United States. You know, other than a few counties in the West and in the Upper West, you know, even rural counties are going to start accepting internally displaced people from climate disasters. And this is only accounting for one climate effect, for sea level rise. It doesn't consider the swaths of other climate effects. It doesn't consider wildfires. It doesn't consider Midwestern flooding. And so the reality is that these migrations have already started, and they will continue throughout the century and even beyond. And so this poses a question, I think, for our churches and our congregations, which is, what is the proper response to widespread migration and climate change? And what I want to propose for us to consider today is that the proper response to these realities is thinking about climate hospitality. How can we consider the virtue of hospitality in an age of climate change? And I think here's the central question for us to consider. How can churches be hubs of climate resilience in their community, helping their neighbors weather the physical and the spiritual storms of the climate crisis? The reality is that in many of these places, congregations are the strongest network of social community. They have access to land, to buildings, to all of these assets that can be used as forces of hospitality, both for our fellow humans and for our non-human communities that are being affected by climate change. And what I also want to say is that climate hospitality isn't something dramatically new for our communities. It's actually an extension of the good work that many of our congregations are already engaged in. Because in the work of climate hospitality, the realities of climate change are incorporated into the mission of our religious communities. These communities are already serving the role as refuge and caretaker for their communities. And so we ought to be considering, what does the role of refuge and caretaker mean in an age of climate crisis, with unfolding climate disasters happening around the world, and, as Rob Nixon has written, the slow violence of climate change unfolding particularly in environmental justice communities. And I want to share a couple images of what climate hospitality in action can look like and what it is looking like in some communities. One way that many churches are already engaged in climate hospitality is through disaster preparedness and response. So in the top left there, that's Miracle City Church in Baltimore, Maryland, with their disaster response crew, pulling together dozens of volunteers to respond to some flooding that happened in poor and communities of color in the city of Baltimore. Faith-based disaster response agencies represent the largest group of disaster response, both domestically and globally. And so what does it look like for us to start making the connections between our disaster response and climate resilience more clear? And how can our work of mobilizing volunteers for disaster response also be mobilized for disaster preparedness and for climate resilience? Well, one thing that we can do is has been shown at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Annapolis, Maryland. And what St. Luke's did is they attended to the non-human forces around us that also affect our ability to be resilient churches. So St. Luke's sits right on the Chesapeake Bay in Annapolis, Maryland, which is one of the most susceptible towns to sunny day flooding. So without any kind of rain event, on an extreme high tide day in Annapolis, water will just start rising up through the drains. That as the tide comes in, then downtown Annapolis will flood. And so what St. Luke's did is they decided to restore a buried wetland on their property, and they were able to work with some partners to get some grant funding to recreate what God's creation might have originally looked like on that property, which means a living shoreline down on Back Creek. It means a series of step pools from their property that on the way down filter out pollution. And what that means is that when downtown Annapolis is flooding, St. Luke's is absorbing that extra water. And this is the miracle of God's creation, is that when we are able to be part of restoring and protecting these ecosystems, that not only protects non-human creation, but it buffers our human towns and our human cities from the worst effects of climate change, as they're shown in sea level rise and in hurricanes. Another example of this is Eastminster Presbyterian Church in Indy Atlantic, Florida, which is engaged in mangrove planting along the shores in their city. And another example I want to highlight is Crosstown Church in Charleston, South Carolina. This is a church that was flooded 3 years in a row because of hurricanes that were just pummeling Charleston. And so what they did is they had financial resources, which I know is not common for our congregations, but maybe you're part of a congregation with a lot of financial resources. So what they did is they worked with some local scientists to commission a flood study to figure out what are the root causes of this flooding. Yes, climate change, of course, is intensifying rainstorms, but what are some of the proximate causes? And they found out that unsustainable development upstream, more pavement that was being laid down as strip malls were being built, as new suburban housing developments were being built, meant that water was not being absorbed into the ground, but was flowing downstream into their little community. And so they got engaged in a local advocacy to change some of the zoning laws to advocate for more sustainable development so they could care better for their community. So these are just a few examples of climate hospitality in action. And what I want you to take away from this is that every church, every congregation has assets that can be utilized for climate resilience. And what it requires is an understanding of how climate change is making itself manifest in your community, and an understanding of what assets you can use to address those needs. The final thing that I want to talk about today, and I hope to invite us into some conversation here around this, is the role of prayer and the role of worship in environmental justice. And I end here because this is really core to what faith communities bring to the conversation around environmental justice. And that's because the ways that we structure our worship life inside the walls of our sanctuary reverberate beyond the walls of our sanctuary. That incorporating both elements of climate education and worship of God through creation can develop norms that support God's people and God's creation in the midst of the climate crisis. That perhaps new rituals that are grounded, firmly grounded in our tradition, can help us make meaning in the midst of the climate crisis and spur us towards action. We need to incorporate new modes of confession, lament, and vision into our liturgies, because what we're presented with is a new reality. And I firmly believe that our traditions offer a response to the realities of climate change. And our traditions invite us into a kind of creative imagination for responding in ways that are grounded, but also fertile soil for making new connections. So I actually want to invite us into some conversation here. And I'm going to invite you to either comment in the chat or unmute yourself. We'll invite you to unmute yourself and share your response to these questions. The first question for us is simply, why do we pray? I think this is a really important place for us to start. Why do we pray? What happens when we pray? Go ahead and send your responses into the chat or unmute yourself and speak up. Antelope saying it changes us. Yes. Greg, to align our will with God's. Mm-hmm. We connect with the divine. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? Marianne, I once heard someone say, I don't pray to change others or to change the situation of the world, but I pray to change myself, and through that, maybe change the world. Marianne saying she's come to appreciate that more and more. Yeah, I'm hearing some themes here of both praying to change ourselves and praying to connect and align ourselves with God's will for our world. Harold, not only to petition God, but to hear God's still small voice to us. Antelope, we humble ourselves before God. Yeah, humility is huge here. Humility is really linked to hospitality too, I think. Andrew, we anchor our faith, strategies, and approaches in the divine. Yeah. Let's get another question in here now. How does the climate crisis call us into new modes of prayer and worship? And what I'll ask here too is, what might those new modes be? Have you seen ways of praying and worshiping that express a kind of climate hospitality? Or can you imagine new ways of prayer and worship that do so? And I'll note in response to the last question, Jim saying to praise and thank God. Yeah, praise Praise and thanksgiving is huge for, especially in recognizing the beauty and the resilience of God's good creation. Marianne says, praying outside to actually pray in and with creation. The pandemic created opportunities for that in some congregations to continue worship in a safer way, but let's continue that beyond this crisis. Yes, yes. Worship, Antelope coming in again with worship outside. Yeah, exactly. I think a recognition that the community of creation is part of our religious communities is huge. And recognizing that the sacred land on which our congregations are located should be integrated into the worship life of the congregation. Because ultimately that means that the land is within our realm of care and of hospitality, that if we're worshiping alongside the land, then we also need to treat it with pastoral care. Katie saying, could we dare to say that we have more of a chance to suffer with God? Beautiful. Lament, yeah, related to what Katie was saying, lament, as you mentioned, yeah. Suffering alongside those who are suffering. And this is particularly, I think, for communities who are not directly impacted by environmental injustice, that rendering our hearts in a way that we are suffering in solidarity with those who are directly impacted, and that we're lamenting the forces of destruction and oppression. Yeah, and realizing that God is suffering with us. Yes. Well, thank you all for your participation in this discussion. And as ideas continue to percolate in your mind, please share those in the chat. I think this has been really rich, and we'll continue this discussion in just a moment. What I do want to end with is, fittingly, a prayer. And this is a prayer that I wrote thinking about climate resilience and climate disasters, and operating in the mode of prayer as speaking, grounded in tradition, but what new words might be accessible and what might be helpful for us as we respond to the climate crisis. So, will you pray with me? Like Job in the whirlwind, or Jonah in the storm at sea, we come before you in awe of your power, God. We recognize that today's storms and whirlwinds are not your judgment on your people, but the distortion of natural systems through our own sin and hubris. As the storms and whirlwinds of the climate crisis accelerate around us, may our sanctuaries be a place of refuge and resilience, where all of God's creation might be protected and sustained, and from which we, people of God, might be sent forth to bring healing and justice. Amen. Okay, everyone. We're going to transition now into a time of discussion. And so I want to invite you all to, if there are questions or comments that have come up for you during this time, please bring those up. You can either bring them up in the chat or unmute yourself.
Before we do that, Avery, just because most people joined us at the later half of the workshop, apparently there was a wrong link. I wanted to take a screenshot again. So if you don't mind turning on your camera and giving me a smile or a wave, I'd like to take a nice screenshot of us. Those who joined us earlier, like the 5 people, we had that, but this would be great to have another picture. And I've been using the running joke. I'm really good at Photoshop, so I can make you younger, older, whatever you want. Just let me know. Yes. Oh, this is great. This is beautiful. And we're gonna try this in a second as people's nice faces appear on our screen. Okay, so give me a smile or a wave and let me try and get this. Thank you. If it's terrible, we'll take shot 2. Just give me 1 second. Oh, perfect. On the first try. The first time it was delicate. So thank you. But we do want to see your nice faces, and we want this to be an opportunity for a discussion. And so if you don't mind, you can keep your camera on, but no pressure. But like as Avery said, we want to enter into a time of just discussion based on what we said. And for those who joined later, I'm sure a recording of this would be available as well, Avery, so people can have that.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I am so sorry about the link confusion. I have no idea what happened, but I'm really sorry. That must have been frustrating for y'all to be waiting in an empty room, and I'm glad you all made it here.
Yeah, just to say that there were 50 people at some point, so hopefully they can really promote the recording to make sure that all those 50 people and more get to see the richness of your conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. I'll make sure that the link gets out. This whole thing is being recorded, and so we'll make sure that it gets out. Well, I think maybe just to prime the pump a little bit with this discussion, Andrew, I'll pose a question to you, which is, you know, we've been talking a lot about how environmental justice and climate resilience unfolds on a domestic scale. So thinking about this particularly in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But I think whenever we're talking about climate change, we have to be reminded that this is a global problem. And in fact, environmental injustices in the United States are only one very small piece of environmental justices around the globe. So in your work, how are you thinking about how the domestic work here in the United States relates to the global scale?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question, Avery. So for those of you who missed the first part, and again, the recording will show, so the work we do through the Climate Witness Project, it's a campaign of the Christian Reformed Church, Office of Social Justice, and World Renew. And World Renew, actually, it's our relief and development agency, so internationally and domestically. And the reason why there's a vested interest in this work in addressing the climate crisis is because our international partners are living the climate crisis. Like, this is not something that it's in the abstract. The reason why we do this work and we advocate for just climate policy is because it's already here. And so I always tell people when I'm doing some of these workshops and presentations is that I have been to East Africa. We've had country consultants from Bangladesh. And when we are talking about this, there's no debate as in, is this real? Is this happening? Because the farmers in East Africa who are committing suicide because of their crop yield don't have the luxury of the debate. And so this is here and now, and they're looking at, and again, the climate resiliency, looking at ways of adaptation and mitigation. And so conservation agriculture is a huge thing in East Africa, responding to the climate crisis. Again, another global perspective is what is happening in Bangladesh right now. 2/3 of Bangladesh is underwater, flash floods. And so all these climate-related disasters have impressed upon us and our denomination and the work, the relief and development work that we do, that what we do here in North America like resonates everywhere. And so we need to advocate for environmental justice. And that's why we talked about the expression, the tangible expression of our faith and love for neighbor is the work that we're doing. It's interesting that EAD is virtual now. In the past where we've done that, we've had actually field consultants from like East Africa, Bangladesh to join us in our advocacy work. And so when we go on Capitol Hill, we have these people speak to our members of Congress. And if you're able to hear them, I think you see that there's people outside North America are usually like, what are we thinking? Like, it's not even a debate thing. And so I think what we do here and how we work with international organizations is so key. And I love that in recent times, we've been able to reshape what we think about neighbor. Like, we think about global neighbor, and it's no longer just a very limited perspective of that. So yeah, I could go on, but I think this is something that really moves the work that we do. And so there's a huge, obviously, domestic things that are happening here that Avery pointed out, but there's also that sort of international. What is the global church doing to meet this very moment? So yeah.
Great, thanks, Andrew.
Can I say something?
Go for it.
You brought up the global, and I'm so glad that EAD has allowed all these voices of people that are affected. If we could get that to be seen, we need journalists that will tell these stories and let the people tell the stories. And I wanted to just promote Interfaith Power and Light is promoting this movie Kiss the Ground. I don't know if anybody has seen it yet. And there's so much rich things in there about farming. I am not a farmer, but I live in Nebraska where lots and lots of farms are all around me in my city. And regenerative farming has so much to do with the climate. And so, yeah, if anybody wants to research that, Interfaith Power and Light is recommending Kiss the Ground, and it really relates to climate change and justice. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Sue. Yeah, Harold.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, and it's not to devalue anything that we've been talking about, but I started receiving communications from Creation Justice Ministries maybe a couple of months ago, and you know, concurrently, I read part of latest book by Michael Mann, who is one of the world's leading climate scientists. You may be familiar with him. And I've noticed a kind of shift, just from my perspective. Okay, I'm not saying that it's generalized, but a shift from looking at I would say looking at the causes of climate change and maybe trying to change policy in that area. You know, I participated in some pipeline protests and so on in recent years. To this term resilience, which I think is kind of, well, to me anyway, it was a new term, you know, in climate discussions. And I understand the importance of dealing with the effects of climate change. I can see how directly they're related to social justice. And but there is a danger, I think, that Michael Mann pointed out in his book is that there are vested interests in, you know, fossil fuel companies, other extractive industries, et cetera, to distract people away from climate change issues. And one of the ways they can do that is to focus exclusively on what you would call resilience. It's a very important thing, but on the other hand, I don't think we should let ourselves be distracted from dealing with the causes of climate change. I just wanted to throw that out there, not to put a damper on anything, but just a reminder.
Yeah, no, Harold, you're naming such an important aspect of this, which is we can't talk about climate resilience without talking about climate mitigation. And really at its core, climate mitigation is climate resilience, because what we do now is going to impact whether we have 8 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, or whether we have 2 or 3 feet of sea level rise, you know, or less than that. We don't know for sure how much, but you know, the reality is that if organizations are talking about climate resilience and adaptation and not talking about climate mitigation, then that's it's important to ask why. And, you know, perhaps it is coming from, you know, entrenched interests, like you said,
I read
but preventing
that
harm is huge.
sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Sue.
I read articles that the fossil fuels and big companies are also creating large advertising and pushes on social media and whatever for us to take individual responsibility, because they know that's not really going to change things. So we need to remember to push back, and that's why this is so important, EAD. And yeah.
Yeah, and just a quick thing to that, I would say is that I have found more recently in my work that there are different roles and different roles in activism and different paths in what we do, and that each role or each sort of approach is important to the work. And so mitigation, adaptation, and the context with which you find yourself. And for me, I'm a big advocacy person. So Harold, I'm with you. Like, I'm like, we need structural change. We need an overhaul of our system. Let's stop having these conversations about, oh, the feel good, I did this personal. Yeah, personal things are good, but it's like 20% of the work. But one thing is that we need to also see how there isn't one exclusive way of doing the work, and each role is important. And I'm just putting, yeah, exactly. I'm gonna put this link. I actually wrote on this in our Do Justice, and it's in the link. And it takes from Bill Moyer's like 4 roles of activism. And there's like the rebel, there's like the social change agent. And in the climate discussion, sometimes we chain us one particular way. Like, this is the way, but there are different ways of thinking and different modes, and we need to make sure it's in harmony together. But I think it's a concern, and I think it's a valid concern that corporate America and our very capitalist society thinks of creative ways of trying to move the attention. You feel like it's my personal responsibility, but no, we need an overhaul. We need our current system to change, and policy work is so important. And that's why I'm excited for EAD and the opportunity that you get to engage with members of Congress on these issues. But I think the bottom line is that each one of us have a role, and each one of us have a role in like the great tapestry of God's faithfulness. And that's the beauty of it, in my opinion. So just my 2 cents on that as well. You can check out what I wrote, not to self-promote, but it took a wrestling for me to really come that there are different approaches to this, and each one of them is important.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Marianne.
I would just add to that I think also that as people of faith, it's really important in that mitigation conversation to be attentive to the how. I think the environmental groups can get very focused on the technical parts of reducing global emissions and all these things. And I think it's important for us as people of faith to be thinking about that. We do that mitigation, we do that reduction of emissions while repairing the damage to communities from fossil fuel extraction, and making sure we don't replicate that damage with renewables. So for instance, where do we put big solar farms and wind farms that they're not sited on indigenous communities' land, or blocking migratory paths or what have you? So I think there's a lot of conversation to be had about not just the what of mitigation, but the how, and including people in the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marianne. Yes. With our final 2 minutes, or 1 minute now, I'm going to share some slides again to send you forth with some resources from both Creation Justice Ministries and Climate Witness Project. So the first is the Faithful Resilience Guide. This can be found at creationjustice.org/resilience. And there are a number of other climate resilience resources on there, including links to the video series. We've been doing a series on climate resilience since last August with a number of different recordings from virtual workshops. So that's again at creationjustice.org/resilience.
Yes, and with this, you can literally Google CWP Advocacy Action Center. I didn't put the link there, but again, the advocacy ways, we always have ways that you can, by a click, contact your member of Congress on a particular issue with the climate crisis. So we try to update that. Right now, if you go there, we have some environmental justice resources there, as well as ways that you can contact your member of Congress on this. So you can just Google that. And then the next slide, I think, Avery. And we talked about worship and prayer. We offer the Climate Witness Project, again, you can Google this, offers a lot of resources, creation care resources. So we have crowdsourced like liturgies, prayers that you can, again, that creative reimagining of worship and what that looks like. We have a curated list of resources there. And then the next one, or I think there's no next one. Okay, this is the last slide that we have. This is our contact for Avery and myself. We want you to look at this as an invitation to like the first conversation. And there's so much more that we could do, and we could walk alongside you. So please feel free to reach out to us so we can get you connected and plugged into different opportunities and resources. Would love to do that. But this is the first conversation of many that we should be having. And we are really, really grateful that you've been able to join us for this conversation. We hope that your EAD experience, even in the virtual space, is really great, and that we see more of you and more of others joining for next year as well. And all the very best for those who are joining the advocacy session tomorrow. Go with power and faith. You got it. Anything else, Avery, before we leave?
Just thanks to everyone for tuning in, and thanks for your tenacity. Those of you who came from the other one to this one. The recording will go out, so keep an eye out for that so you can watch what you missed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great one. Bye.